Hi, I'm Brian McLaren. I'm in the mountains of North Carolina. I'm about to have a conversation with a really interesting person named Frank Schaeffer, son of Francis Schaeffer, who is a very influential theologian. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation, and I'm glad you could be part of it. So Frank, I always love getting a chance to talk to you, but I feel a special sense of urgency right now because I've been getting a big uptick lately in the number of people who are calling me with some kind of desperation. They grew up like we did, evangelical. Sometimes it's actually Catholic, sometimes it's Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, but they're in the same struggle. It's like they embrace their religion and their religion's punching them. You know, it's just causing them pain. And they're holding on, but they don't know how long they can hold on and don't know if they should hold on. And but they're afraid if they let go, they'll fall into some deep abyss, you know. And I felt this when I read your most recent book. I don't think anybody describes that tornness and that conflict better than you do. So I think you could help them by telling them how you hold on, why you hold on, or maybe you don't even feel you're holding on. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd like to say is that yes, I've written about these subjects, and the book you're mentioning is Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God. The subtitle of that book is instructive, though. It's how to create beauty, give love, and find peace. The reason I wrote the book is to try to find that for myself.
Yeah.
I don't write books because I choose a subject that I think other people will be interested in. I write books as a way of processing what's happening to me. So, for instance, when my son John was fighting in Afghanistan, I wrote a book called Keeping Faith, a father-son story about love in the United States Marine Corps, followed by another book called Faith of Our Sons, a father's wartime diary. I wasn't writing about those because I was interested in the Marines. I was writing about those because my son was a Marine.
Yeah.
I don't write about my spiritual struggles because of all the subjects in the world, you know, sex, food, travel, art, this is the one that I'm most attracted to. I'd rather be a good food writer.
Yeah.
But I wasn't the son of a great chef who's now processing how to run his own restaurant.
Yes.
I was the son of a theologian and an evangelist,
Yes.
Francis Schaeffer.
Yeah.
And have spent my life essentially as one of the threads that runs through it, along with a lot of other stuff,
Yeah.
processing those issues. So that's the first thing to say. I don't come at this abstractly.
Yeah.
There are no footnotes in the book.
You're
that
not trying
talking
to,
about.
you didn't write this to be helpful to people.
No.
Yeah.
No. And if it is, that's great. But I wouldn't presume to think I could be helpful.
Yeah.
In other words, it's not a book I wrote as therapy for other people, it's therapy for me.
Yeah.
So you've told me, you know, you find the message in the book honest and the wrestling in it honest, and it's simply because I decided to not try to work out on the page anything different than I actually feel. So, you know, you can take on a persona in a book that's really somebody else.
Yeah.
And you can kind of pretend you have
Yeah.
answers when you don't. Just like a father does with a child who says, hey, daddy, or a grandfather, which is what
Yeah.
I'm into these days. But if you're being honest, you're saying, listen, I'm just a kid too. You know,
Yeah.
I know I'm 62 years old, granddaughter of mine,
Yeah.
Lucy, but I don't actually know anything.
Yeah.
You just think I do because I'm big
Yeah.
and you're little. But
Yeah.
you'll learn later when you feel like I still do, you know. So the first thing is I don't have any big, you know, wisdom on this. But, you know, what I would say and what comes out in the book is that for me, a big breakthrough came in trying to understand that you don't have to resolve these issues in order to hold on to your faith. And I would go further than that. I would say one of the reasons a lot of religious faiths are actually lying to the people who are part of them is by holding out the promise of the answer,
Yeah.
when in fact the real promise is that some of the things taught in our various faiths, take Christianity from my past in terms of the life of Christ, hold out an example not of correct belief or ideas, but of behavior toward others.
Yeah.
So the way I would boil it down is that just for me personally, and I know you have other things on this, but I would just say the big shift from my old evangelical right-wing days to now is that I don't look to the Bible for my answers or theology for my answers or my church for my answers. I look for the answer to who I am and what's happened to my life in the eyes of the people who know me best.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a concrete example. I was a teenage father. I got Jeannie pregnant when we were teens. What I saw in the eyes of my daughter Jessica after I screamed at her as an inept teen father who believed that as a Calvinist Christian that God had put me in charge of my home, spare the rod, spoil the child. I saw fear in her eyes if she broke a dish.
Yeah.
What I see in the eyes of my granddaughter Lucy now, who's 5 years old, and I happen to be doing childcare for, and I'm not being Oprah-esque
Yeah.
or sentimental here,
Yeah.
but I see nothing but unconditional trust and love.
Yeah.
Because it isn't that it isn't that I got a better idea.
Yeah.
It is that I, through experience, have understood that parenthood is not about a set of ideas or fatherhood or being a grandparent. It's actually about who I am
Yeah.
myself.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying this to people who are struggling with faith as an intellectual construct.
Yeah.
Do I believe in neo-Calvinist apologetics? Am I a good Anglican Christian? What does the Book of Common Prayer mean to me? What do I think the Bible is? Do I take it literally or not? These are all interesting issues, but I don't think, as I look at the life of Christ as a Christian,
Yeah.
that I see anything there except a life upon which I can model parts of my life, so I see less fear in the eyes of the people who depend
Gosh.
on me.
I mean,
And when you approach it that way, it's
Yeah.
a totally different thing than how do I wrestle with my problems.
it's so ironic because I think a lot of people who are in this conflicted religious identity space,
Yeah.
right? They're afraid.
Yeah.
They're afraid of what their father or their pastor or their aunts
Right.
and uncles are going to say or do to them
Right.
if they are honest and so on. So they're afraid, and then they pass that fear on to others.
Yeah.
And there's something that happens when a person says, this is not right. I don't want to be a victim of this
Yeah.
kind of fear system. I
Yeah.
don't want to be a villain. I don't want to make other people afraid. I mean,
Right.
that's a powerful moment to think, yeah, I made my daughter afraid.
I made my daughter afraid.
Some decision, I will not be that kind of a jerk. I might
Right.
be a jerk.
Right, but I'm
But-
not going to be that kind of a jerk.
I don't want to be a religious jerk on
Right.
top of all the other ways I'm a
Right.
jerk.
And I think for me, one of the areas where I have found more peace, I won't say I have found peace, but that I also talk about in this book, is that essentially if you're looking to resolve certain issues and you are frustrated because you can't resolve them,
Yeah.
if someone says to you, honestly, relax for a minute, you're never going to be able to resolve these.
Yeah.
Then you have a different mindset than if you think you're struggling towards a solution that's eluding you through some fault of
Oh,
your
gosh.
own. So basically, I'm, 5'6.5". I had polio when I was 2. I will never be a world champion marathon runner.
Yeah.
Okay? If I was struggling to do that, thinking that somehow if I could only correctly
Yes.
understand my anatomy, I
Yes.
could get my atrophied foot to be different,
Yes.
I would spend my life smashing my head into a concrete wall.
Yeah.
And so I would say the same thing about people who are wrestling with issues, say, of truth.
Yeah.
What do I take literally? How do I interpret the Bible? As if somehow your own journey as a human being, let alone salvation in that Christian
Yeah.
idea of being saved,
Yeah.
depended on correct knowledge. You keep thinking, well, this is eluding me somehow. But if you come to the conclusion,
Yeah.
nothing is eluding me here,
Yeah.
all these conclusions are false because no one could know these things.
Yes.
Then you can relax
Yeah.
and say, to use my analogy, I don't have to be a marathon runner.
Yeah.
All I got to do is be able to mow my
Yeah.
lawn and be grateful for that. And basically not feel failure because I can only do this at
Gosh.
2.5 miles an hour instead of doing it, instead
Yes.
of winning the Boston Marathon.
Yes.
I'm not. So I just think when this struggle, this hanging on by the fingernails, when I look at myself, I don't know about these other people, but just for me, most of it came because I was trying to do things that are literally impossible to do.
Yeah.
Not just for me, but for anyone.
Yeah.
For instance, correct belief.
Yeah.
And life is no longer in bite-sized pieces. So someone says to me, what is your Christian struggle about now? I'm not ducking the issue when I say it's to be a good grandfather. It's to be a good husband to Jeannie. It's to be the kind of person you'd rather be stuck with on a desert island than the asshole I was when I was 17 and slapping my daughter.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. And what I take from faith are the things that help me to do that.
Yes.
So, like my polio analogy again, it isn't to fix my polio leg. It's to know that if I put a half-inch raise in my dress shoes for a few golden minutes, I don't limp when I
Yes.
walk across a
Yes.
dance floor at somebody's wedding reception.
Yes.
And it's nice for a minute not to look like a cripple.
Yes.
And the rest of the time I just put up with being a cripple. So because I don't have an illusion about it.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we can do something different with
Yeah.
people. It's in that area of
Ah.
expectation.
Well, when you're saying that, I think I'm thinking of the character of I always forget how to pronounce it. The ignumen, the
Iguman?
Iguman.
Yeah.
At the end of "And God Said Billy."
Yeah.
And it's almost as if the character in that book is he meets this spiritual leader
Yeah.
who basically says to him, to use the example you were
Yeah.
using a minute ago, he says, oh, you can't figure this all out? Nobody can.
Right.
You really care about figuring it
Yeah.
out? That's what makes you a good Christian.
Right.
So it's, instead of saying figuring it out makes you a good
Right.
Christian, caring about figuring it
Right.
out makes you a good Christian. And then sort of the analogy or the corollary to that is
Yeah.
pretending you have it figured out makes you a really bad Christian.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing is too, I think a lot of us who come from evangelical type backgrounds, speaking again for myself, always had this sort of secret niggling thought that somehow we were intellectually inferior to, say, our atheist or agnostic friends, or at least atheist or agnostic authors we were reading, or filmmakers, that
Yeah.
these intellectuals were bright enough to not fall for something so stupid as the Christian message that we had fallen for or been raised in.
Yeah.
One thing that my writing has cured me of in terms of the email traffic I get is any idea that non-belief certainty is any smarter than belief certainty. Because having published a book with a title that says Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, I'm getting all kinds of shit from atheists who say, you're not a real atheist. And I actually read their subject lines and they sound so fundamentalist that I think I'm just getting my usual
Yes.
traffic of crap from fundamentalist Christians. And I have to get into the email to find out, oh no, this isn't the fundamentalist Christian. This is a fundamentalist atheist. So one thing I'd say to everybody religious who feels stupid because Dawkins and these other people tell them they're dumb is write something that gets you in the bad graces of atheists
Yeah.
who don't like you because you're not so easy to dismiss because you're not just a straight up fundamentalist. And you will find that they are as dogmatic and doctrinaire and also believe in salvation through correct ideas. They think you can't put your life together until you decide these things. And they are shriveled, small, stupid-sounding people when they
Yeah.
write to you. I'm
Yeah.
not saying every atheist is small,
No.
stupid, or
Yeah.
shriveled, but what I'm
Yeah.
saying is if you're struggling with faith from the point of view that somehow the grass is greener on the other side of the
Yeah.
fence, I assure you, having gotten all sorts of crap from people on the other side of the fence,
Yeah.
that my mother, at her most fundamentalist, Calvinistic, Bible verse a day, all the rest of it, was no more blinkered
Yeah.
than the correspondence that I get from people who have attacked faith as completely moronic. So don't feel threatened by these folks. They have nothing to offer you except another package of false certainty.
You know, I could say the same thing from my own experience, saying it this way. You're part of a group that has some real idiots in it, and
Yeah,
some real,
right.
just some mean-spirited people.
Yeah,
And you think, I'm embarrassed to be part of this group. And then you meet somebody who's really nice from another group. You think,
right.
I'll join that group.
Yeah.
And then you find out, no,
No, they're idiots too.
they've got some bad people.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
maybe what we do is we start saying, you know, we're part of the human race.
Yeah, exactly.
And we've got a whole range of people.
Yeah.
And then what that does is it forces us to say, well, what kind of a human being do I want?
Yeah, and I think that when it comes to the New Atheist movement, I actually had a little email correspondence with Christopher Hitchens before he died, who had read a book of mine, a memoir, Crazy for God, and he liked it.
Yes.
And he emailed me saying, "Oh, and then I finished this book. I'm so disappointed. Why didn't you become one of us?" In other words, he was waiting for my conversion moment,
Yes.
and it doesn't occur because I
Yes.
remain someone of faith,
Yes.
struggling but nevertheless.
Yes.
So I don't think that evangelical Christians or Muslims or whomever have
Yeah.
a corner on the blinkered doctrinaire market.
Yes.
I just think that's a human trait.
Yes.
In the same way that I don't blame every war as somehow a manifestation of a war of religion.
Yes.
They aren't.
Yes.
If there was no religion, semi-evolved, vicious primates would still be killing each other.
Yeah.
Welcome to the human race.
Yeah.
It isn't our problem. It's
Yeah.
not their problem. It's all of our problem.
So in a sense, what I want to do, I think what you want to do, even though we might not say it so overtly, especially in a book that's really
Right.
a kind of a confession and a
Right.
work of art, but I think what we want to say to people is, listen, you have permission to redefine what it means to be a Christian.
Right.
Other people might put the definition on you.
Right.
You got to believe this, hate
Right.
this, but you can say, well, you can call me whatever you want.
Right.
But I'd like to become a more compassionate person.
Yeah.
And what's so striking in your most recent book is that, and you know, Jesus is really a big help in that.
Yes.
You know, and I'm sure this is true in many, if not all, religions.
Yeah.
You can find resources that help you be less of a jerk.
Yeah.
As well as finding resources that will
Yeah.
feed every impulse you ever had toward.
Yeah, and,
cruelty.
and when you look from the Christian tradition in terms of Jesus, you have the sort of official teachings. But one of the things I find interesting, and I'm no theologian, so correct me, but from my reading of Jesus talking in the New Testament, which of course is not Jesus talking, it's somebody who reported it and wrote it down, sometimes a long time later, word of mouth and all the rest of it. That said, so we'll just say what, Jesus said. Every time he deals with his own scripture, and of course there wasn't one, because the Torah was not just a set of books the way we have, right?
Right.
Up until about the year 100 from what I understand. But anyway, he's not only contradicting it, he is doing just what you said. And that is, he's saying, what in here will make you the kind of person I'd like to be stuck with on a desert island?
Yeah.
And by the way, what doesn't? Forget that.
Yeah.
I know what Scripture says, but here's what I'm telling you. So
Yeah.
it's not just the big ones, like the woman taken in adultery.
Yeah.
He says, the Scripture says, never mind that.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, that's what he says.
Yeah.
Never mind that. Here's what I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Every time the Torah comes up as a doctrinaire statement, Jesus is saying, well, actually, not so much.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a very liberal, he's a very bad evangelical Protestant.
Yes.
I mean, because he doesn't believe in the Bible.
Yeah. You have heard it said, but
here's what I say.
The word "but" says a lot.
Yeah, it says a lot. But it isn't only that. It's with the Samaritan woman. He's saying, yeah, you're from the enemy tribe. Yes, you don't worship right. But guess what? It's not going to matter anyway, because it's all spirit and truth. Forget geography.
Yeah.
Forget your labels.
Yeah.
So what I take away is Jesus is anti-labeling, and he's constantly revising how he takes his own scripture. And yet we look at that and we say, well, that's Jesus, we can't do that. And yet, of course, when you look at the rest of the New Testament, it's Paul and everybody else revising again what Jesus said, trying to make it fit the nascent organization of the church and feed it. This is a process. It's not a series of conclusions. Yeah, I think a lot of people who at least come from the evangelical tradition are, quote, people of the book.
Yeah.
And that begins and ends with that. And so they keep trying to define life by this book. And, again, I don't want to be, like I say, too much like Oprah Winfrey here. But in the end, the only book that matters, and I know this sounds sentimental, but I'm serious. The only book that matters to me is what I see in the eyes of the people who know me best. Because there's where the bullshit ends. Jeannie gets up with me every morning. Lucy comes to my house for childcare 5 days a week. These people know me. What do I read in their eyes? That's the mirror that counts, not how do I judge myself according to, am I living according to my interpretation of a book? And I really believe that if we could get to that, the struggle changes entirely. It's still a struggle, but it's not that. It isn't the struggle to achieve truth and say, now I've solved this, we're going to be fine.
So we're having this conversation on a Thursday. On Monday, I got an email from an old friend, fundamentalist pastor, whose son went to college, and just was about to graduate, and just came out. And so now the father has to decide, does he stay loyal to his religious community, his employment and all his dependent? And if he does that, then he sides with the people who exclude and marginalize, stigmatize his son. Does he remain loyal to his son? And if he does, he might lose his job. He will lose his job. So suddenly this all becomes very real, and it's all a matter of fathers and sons. Of course, that's a big part of our life too. So I want to ask you a question about your own development. Was there a moment or a dramatic moment where you remember thinking, oh crap, this isn't going to work. I'm not going to make it as an evangelical.
Right. I don't know if there was a moment, but there was a realization that the hope I had of being part of something that my dad had started that would change the nature of evangelicalism fundamentally was not going to happen. So for me, it was always, I'm an evangelical Christian, and then immediately afterward, and of course my father would have said the same thing, but the evangelical world is broken. However, if we do these 3 things or 7 things or 5 more seminars or whatever, we can start something else. We can make it better. So for me, it was really the realization that the problem was not going to be fixed by some tinkering. That there was something much more profound. Now, I didn't know what it was, but I knew there was something. And it's taken me a long time to try to work out a few ideas about what that might be. And, one of them is this idea of being saved because you have correct ideas, rather than salvation being a lifelong journey away from yourself to something better or toward a better self. And that there aren't these clear demarcation lines. So,
let me just interrupt to say, but I know a lot of evangelicals will say, we believe you're only saved by grace.
Right.
But the truth is, you might be saved by grace, but you're not accepted by
Right.
this community unless
Yeah.
you have the right ideas.
But I guess for me now, I guess to show perhaps how far this journey's taken me, when I use the word saved, I'm not even thinking of it in theological terms
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah.
I'm talking about being saved from seeing the pain in the eyes of a child you just hit.
Yes.
I'm talking about being saved from
Saved from sin. In
Yourself.
The truest, most existential sense
who
of the
you
word.
are, not earning God's love
Yeah.
or forgiveness.
Yeah.
And again, my own family relationships have been very instructive here, and that is there came a point with me when, at my worst, I couldn't think of a time when I would burn one of my children in hell forever, even if they wound up killing me.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd do something,
Yeah.
but you wouldn't punish them for eternity.
Yes.
That's a long time.
Yes.
So the nonsense of the evangelical premise of the saved-lost paradigm became evident to me, not through some new theological idea,
Yeah.
but simply living long enough to understand that if someone who was on a spiritual journey like me, who had done plenty bad, would not do this,
Yeah.
why would I think that that level of empathy would come from a creator
Yeah.
who would do this?
Yeah.
You
yeah.
know,
Yeah.
it just didn't make sense anymore. So it wasn't like a moment, but I think it was a very clear thing to me when I realized that evangelical theology wasn't going to change, and that this can't be fixed because it is the bedrock upon which this kind of a thing is built. So for me, it wasn't a moment of revelation. It was just a growing away and
Accumulating.
an accumulated alienation
Yeah.
from that background.
Well, it's interesting what you said about your dad's project in some ways
Right.
to try to save evangelicalism.
Yeah.
Because, I had a moment, and mine
Yeah.
was in middle school.
Yeah.
I was in a Sunday school class,
Yeah.
and I was a science nerd. I still am. Like,
Yeah.
I'm noticing what birds are singing around
Yeah.
us. I always have loved that sort of
Yeah.
thing. I loved evolution. Like, as a 8th grade kid,
Right.
I just thought evolution is fascinating. And in my Sunday school class one day, I don't think I asked the question. I just think the Sunday school teacher said, look, you can either believe in God or evolution.
Yeah.
You can't have it both ways.
Yeah.
And I just remember this little click happen. Like, okay, I'm 14 years old. 4 years from now, I'm 18. I am so out of here.
Yeah.
But then I got converted and got
Yeah.
filled with the Spirit and had
Yeah.
all these experiences. And I got recruited into your dad's project.
Right.
How can we save evangelicalism?
Right.
And in a certain way, it almost feels like I became part of this dysfunctional family with an alcoholic father.
Yeah.
Everybody's trying to save their dad. He's really good at heart, you
Right.
know, and we never turn him in for his abuse and all
Yeah.
the rest. So I wonder if at any point you think your dad ever thought, this is a losing battle. Why even?
Well, I think he did, because he went to Europe, and when he split with his missionary board over a typical situation of evangelical dispute within a ministry, he stayed. And essentially voted with his feet. So, the Francis Schaeffer that I grew up with was someone who talked about evangelical theology when asked. But given his druthers, he would be in the Uffizi in Florence looking at Botticelli paintings.
Yeah.
And yes, he had to come up with some sort of rationale in books like How Should We Then Live, where he talked about the humanism that came out of the Renaissance as opposed to the art that was created in Reformation Holland.
Yeah.
But given where he voted in terms of his action and where he
Yeah.
took his family, there was already a dichotomy there between, hey, listen, we are not American evangelicals. He's bringing his kids up, if I don't want to sound snobbish, but as cultured Europeans.
Sure.
in quote, pagan Roman Catholic
Yeah.
countries. And yes, there's a lot of talk about Reformation art, but it's essentially Dad became more interested in art and culture than he was in religion in
Yeah.
terms of where he spent his time. I'll put it this way. On the chaise longue at the bottom of his bed, because he didn't have an office, he worked on the corner of his bed in a rocking chair. I mean, this is not someone who made money out of evangelical Christianity, unlike some people we could mention.
Yeah.
But Dad had an open art book propped up, and he just turned the page every day. And it didn't matter what the page hit. It could be Botticelli, and then it could be de Chirico or Marcel Duchamp, or it could be Rembrandt. There was always an art
Yeah.
book open. I never saw any Bible verses up on his
Yeah.
wall.
Yeah.
I mean, he had really immersed himself
Wow.
in being interested in art and culture. And then he tried to bring that back and help him in
Yes.
his other life.
Yes.
But the two didn't really go together. So if there was a moment for me, it was that realization that you can either go with this Francis Schaeffer,
Yeah.
the one that was good to be with, or the guy who was still talking about reformed theological solutions to, sin
Yeah.
and original sin and all the rest, and of which he personally had less and less interest. So, my dad was wrestling too, but it came out in a different way.
I read all of his books.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I grew up fundamentalist. So
Yeah.
what your dad represented to me was liberalism.
Right.
Because he could talk about philosophy.
Right.
If in my church someone mentioned philosophy, they quote a verse from Colossians.
Right.
Don't be part of vain philosophy.
Yeah.
He talked about art. He liked rock and roll music. At
Right.
least talked about it.
Yeah.
And so he represented this liberalizing opportunity for me. But, when he wrote Christian Manifesto,
Right.
I remember thinking, this is creepy.
Yes.
This guy sounds like people could be taking up guns and
Which in the end they did.
Yeah,
And with a direct line from my dad's book, Christian Manifesto, to some of the bombing of the abortion clinics.
crazy
And,
stuff.
Crazy stuff that was essentially taken a step further by other people.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, there's no way. And I'm not pointing the finger of him because I was part of what he was doing.
Yeah.
I was his sidekick at that time.
Yes.
And so, what we did led to some of the craziest fringe behavior. And when I say led to, maybe the most charitable way to put it was certainly gave it a kind of a basis so that crazy people felt a little less crazy when they did really bad things. And I know Dad had a role in some of those things. So there's no question that what we were involved with when it got into the religious right issues, in terms of the anti-abortion movement, it not only led to the further polarizing of the American nation
Yeah.
through the rise of the religious right and then the Tea Party and all this other stuff, but direct acts of violence, which I
Yeah.
think were justified in people's heads by passages in Christian Manifesto where Dad was saying this is exactly the same issue that Dietrich Bonhoeffer faced
Yes.
when he agreed to the plot to assassinate Hitler.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
Scary.
how do you, you can't get too clear and much clearer than that in terms of spelling out where you think things might legitimately go.
So, and when I read your more recent works where you talk about your dad, I get this picture. Like, some people think you've been very critical of your dad. I just think you show this loving side of your dad. And if the pastor in me wants to say,
Yeah.
your dad loved God by loving beauty. Like,
Yes.
beauty was
Yeah.
his portal.
Yeah.
And he brought that to a
Yeah.
lot of people.
Yeah.
But the people who read his books didn't have that portal.
Yeah.
So what they really loved was power.
Right.
And there's a way that people discover a God. It might be Mars and
Yeah.
not, Jesus or whatever.
Yeah.
But they discover some god of war
Yeah.
that becomes their god of power.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder about something.
Yeah.
If your dad at age, he died when he was how old?
72.
72. So if your dad at age 60,
Yeah.
65, could zip forward in time and meet you today, or
Right,
you could go back in
right.
time, could he get you? Do you think he'd get
Yeah,
you?
I think he would, in the sense that I remember the arts festivals he was running at L'Abri, which were very much like Wild Goose Festival here. I mean, we had people reading, poems that had pornography in them, what would have been regarded as dirty stuff by evangelicals. We had real paintings and, real art, little short film clips. Dad always was someone who was open to the idea that you had honest discussions, and he and I would have had a real talk. But what he wouldn't have done is say, you absolutely have to come back to the fold. He would engage with the ideas. Then at the end of the day, he might say he disagreed or agreed.
Yeah.
But I think that my father also, you have to understand the generation he came out of,
Yeah.
Westminster Faith Seminary, all that. These kind of possibilities were not open to
We're
anybody.
not even there.
I mean,
That's
so
right.
this is like talking to someone who is gay, whose father was gay, but his father didn't come out.
Yes.
Now, that's a
was a
loaded
different world.
analogy,
Yeah.
but it's similar,
Yeah,
because it was
sure.
unthinkable.
Sure.
So it's like saying, well, why didn't your dad come out if he loved art and was so compassionate?
Yeah.
Well, hello,
Yeah.
the 1940s, 50s, 60s, this wasn't that world.
Yeah.
Well, it was very similar. And so I think my dad went as far as he could within the framework of thinking, I've been called to the ministry.
Yeah.
I have to remain a Reformed theologian. I'm in or out.
Yeah.
I'll come right up to the line on all of this.
Yeah.
But I can't actually take a step completely away from where I would like to go,
Yeah.
by, for instance, saying, "Hey, wait a minute. Let's entertain the thought for a moment that the humanist Renaissance wasn't all so bad. That Christians weren't really all doing very great things.
Yeah.
and that what came out of Northern Europe finally in the final analysis was 2 world wars and Hitler. So let's be honest, that Germany, and Bach and Luther, they didn't exactly become, the good guys in the end.
Yes.
Let's take a step back and really look and say, well, wait a minute, maybe the best thing that came out of the Reformation was the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Because it's a good Reformation heresy. I mean,
Yes.
Voltaire isn't judging the church based on humanism. He's saying you're hypocrites compared to what Jesus does.
Yes.
I, in fact, have a section in Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God about Voltaire where I'm really quoting him with this crazy
Yes.
analogy he wrote about
Yes.
Jesus.
Yes.
So, I think Dad could almost taste it in the
Yeah.
discussions.
Yeah.
On Saturday night in the Brie, you could go to those discussions. He was so open with
Yeah.
agnostics and atheists and other people.
Yeah.
Almost like that verse in the New Testament where it says, I'm almost there. Where he's talking to Paul.
Yeah.
What's he say? But
Almost you persuaded me.
almost you persuaded me. And Dad sometimes would be talking with a really bright or wonderful person who was clearly not only sincere but had good things to say. And and then it was always, but wait a minute. My identity
Yeah.
as Francis Schaeffer is now at stake. And so I would say the only difference between Dad and me in terms of our love of art would be that I didn't come out of the 1920s and 30s battles
Yes.
with Machen and Princeton and
Yes.
theology. So I didn't feel a sense of betrayal. So in a way, the best testimony of my dad's openness is that his son, who loves him and
Yes.
defends him in his books
Yes.
and says, Dad was a wonderful person, whether
Yes.
you agree or disagree, here he is as a human being, felt the freedom
Yes.
to actually step away.
See.
And so it's like, yeah, my dad stayed in the closet, as it were.
Yeah.
But I came out.
Yeah.
Well, what's that say about my father?
Yeah.
So I don't see this huge line
Yeah.
between Dad. I see myself very much as I'm not in any way saying carrying on. God forbid. I wouldn't want to.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's what I stepped away from was this
Right.
nepotistic carrying on business.
Yes.
But where when I write novels about the Marines, that's one thing. When I write a book, God Said Billy, the one you talked
Yeah.
about, that's a different thing. But when I come back to this book, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, obviously, that's Francis Schaeffer's son writing. I can't
Yes.
duck that.
Yes.
And I'm not trying to.
Yes.
Nor am I trying to answer him. But I'm saying, hey, let's flip that for a minute.
Yeah.
Isn't it great that Francis Schaeffer took his son, being a fundamentalist Christian himself, and a Calvinist and all the rest, had the freedom to take me to the Uffizi and show me the Renaissance paintings?
Yeah.
Isn't it great that he let me read, books by people he didn't agree with?
Yes.
Isn't it great that nudity was never an issue because he had art books on his bed?
Yes.
Isn't it great that gay bashing was never something we got into, even in the religious right when we were into it?
Yes.
Because gay people were all welcome at L'Abri. He
Yes.
didn't make a sermon about it.
Yeah.
That's just how you treated people who were gay.
Yeah.
So I like to flip it and say, hell of a guy. I mean, look at this.
Actually, can I pick up on
Look at
that?
the freedom that he gave his family.
Because I feel this, when I read you and as we become
Yeah.
friends, I feel like you are a very positive part of the Schaeffer legacy.
Yeah, yeah.
And your comment brings to mind a story from my own parenthood.
Yeah.
Once my daughter was a teenager, and she said, "Dad, I need to talk to you in private. Can you come to my room?" So we go into her room. She shuts the door.
Serious stuff. It's
Oh,
like
boy,
what's
it
happening
gonna
here.
be?
Yeah.
So we sit down on the edge of her bed, and she says, "Dad, you believe in evolution, don't you?" I said, "Yeah." She says, "I don't believe in evolution."
Yeah.
Well, right at that moment, I knew what had happened.
Yeah.
We had a youth pastor who I knew sort of thought I was a little off the deep end.
Yeah.
So he had told the youth group
Yeah.
that the pastor was wrong.
Yeah.
And so she was telling me, I'm siding with the youth pastor, not with you.
Yeah.
But what was so beautiful about it is she knew I would love her and accept her.
Yes, and
so
she could tell
in a
you
certain
that.
sense, he wouldn't accept her if she agreed with me.
Yeah.
So she was basically getting a dispensation from me to disagree
say.
with me because she knew I
Exactly
loved
right.
her and she was safe with me.
Yeah.
And so I think there is just this strange thing of a kind of parent
Yeah.
who takes a person as far as they can.
Yes.
And when the child goes farther,
Yeah.
they're mature enough
To handle it.
to handle it.
And I think part of that was with when I saw in my mother's legacy.
Yeah.
I tell this story in one of my nonfiction books, but when I wrote this novel, Portofino, which was
Which I
which you
absolutely
like,
love.
and you've probably sold more copies than anybody else has, because I'm always running into people who say, Brian McLaren told me to read Portofino.
I love that.
But anyway, it's a work of humor. It's
Yeah.
not a big, heavy thing. It's a novel, but there's a character in it who's sort of like Edith Schaeffer, and another character who's sort of like Francis Schaeffer, not as they became, but when they weren't famous and just young missionaries in Europe with young children. And, you know, that book basically tells a story about a child's coming of age in a context of being embarrassed by their faith because his mother's telling long graces at a pensione in Italy. Everybody else is digging into their antipasti and they're all praying loudly to save the unconverted. So it's sort of tongue-in-cheek. It's a funny book. But there were people who took great umbrage because by the time I wrote it, I was leaving the evangelical world. So first of all, they didn't like me now.
Yes.
Secondly, it was not respectful of certain aspects of fundamentalism from their point of view.
Yeah.
Because you know, you don't make fun of these things, quote unquote. So they were writing me furious letters saying how ashamed my parents must be. Now, the book came out after my dad had died, so I can't honestly say what my dad would have thought of it, although I know he would have liked it.
Yeah.
But you can't prove that.
Yeah.
But I can prove my mom liked it because she bought a dozen hardcover copies and sent them to me to sign them to give to her best friends.
Wow.
And she says, I'm so proud of you. This is a great book.
Wow.
So she certainly was someone who, and that was the beginning of my journey out.
Yes.
I mean, Portofino was my Declaration of Independence.
Yes. So
And my mom said, this is a great book. I'm so proud of you. Can you get me a dozen hardcovers of the first edition to send to Betty Ford, you know, Joanne Kemp, the people in the Schaeffer Bible Study in Washington.
Wow.
I mean, not just friends, but the friends that mattered most to her,
Yes.
very prestigious people that
Yes.
she wanted to impress because, like a proud parent, she's so proud of her son who's now, you know, gotten out of the movie business and he's writing novels. And look, so while I'm getting letters from fundamentalist Christians saying your parents must be so ashamed of you because of that book, forget everything
Yes.
that happened since.
Yes.
Mom's sending out hardcover signed copies
Yes.
to her best friends.
Yes.
So now what's that tell you about who these Schaeffers were
Yeah.
if you take the one piece out of the puzzle, which is this 6-year detour into the Jerry Falwell labyrinth
Yeah.
that they got into,
Yeah.
partly because of me, partly because they got greedy for power themselves, because we all get sucked in. It's nice to have access. But, you know, who the real Schaeffers were is a lot closer to my mom, who's saying, I don't care whether the character of Elsa Becker is laughable and it's modeled on me. What do you think writers write about? I mean, of course they model it on who they grew up with. It's really funny and it's well written. I think it's great. And so, you know, she's sending out copies.
Yes.
So, I mean, I rest my case in terms of like how shocked my parents would be because my dad was dead. But if my mom had thought my dad would have hated it,
Yeah.
she wasn't gonna
Yeah.
be sending it out. She knew Dad would have liked it, and for the same reason that he liked art, paintings, and literature. So it wasn't. The break isn't there,
Yes. We've mentioned politics a couple times, but I want to go into the deep end here. So Mike Huckabee, Tim LaHaye, Michelle Bachmann, Randall Terry, and many others would credit your father as, in his work, of giving them the inspiration for their peculiar blend of religion and politics, which I find, I can't find words strong enough to say how harmful I think it is.
Yeah.
And misguided I think
Yeah.
it is. And I think your father would probably feel the same way if he saw the voter suppression and the homophobia and the demagoguery and all that.
Yeah.
So I want to imagine that I could disappear from this chair
Yeah.
and a composite of Mike Huckabee, Michelle Bachmann, some of these other people were sitting here. And what would you say? What would you want to say to them, sort of as you and knowing
What my dad
the
would have
backstory?
thought.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of my father, I can say very clearly that, he would have literally loathed what these folks have done. And I can say that unequivocally based on the welcome he gave gay men and women in L'Abri, including his secretary and a helper that lived in a back room together as a couple. That some other workers in the work were saying, hey, do you know what's going on? And he was saying, nothing that I'm going to do anything about. Who are you to judge?
Yeah.
So he would have loathed them. And had they been in L'Abri and seen the way he ran his ministry, forget what they read in some book that came out in the heat of the religious right and how they took it,
Yeah.
they would have loathed him.
Yeah.
there would have been no connection between the religious right people that you mentioned and my father if they had ever come to L'Abri between the years, let's say, of 1960 and 1970. None. Because they would have said it's a hippie commune. Francis Schaeffer knows some of the kids there are taking drugs. He doesn't throw them out. People are going down to the cafe and drinking to excess and getting drunk, and he's saying, well, you know, what do you expect from a repressed culture? There's nothing wrong with somebody having a drink, and okay, so he gets drunk. What am I going to do about it? There are homosexuals living on the premises with the knowledge, and not only that, he's made one of them his helper. They would have hated L'Abri, and they would have hated him, period, based on how it ran. And I'm not making that up. That's how he ran his ministry. It was tolerant and it was open. And that's why we had a mixture of British rock and rollers, recovering heroin addicts, who were, by the way, take off into the woods and shoot up anyway because they were recovering, they weren't there, and Dad never threw people out. And who he didn't like having around were exactly people who wound up like Michelle Bachmann and Mike Huckabee. Hard-assed American evangelicals who, as he put it, had no compassion. And his whole thing was, where if there's no compassion and there's no love, then Christ is not present. So Dad started there. Now, that doesn't mean he was consistent in his message in some of the books like A Christian Manifesto. But in terms of how he treated people and who was there, it was an absolute denial of where the religious right went. That's first thing. Second thing, there was an actual incident when he was in Mayo Clinic being treated for cancer, where what's her name, who used to do commercials for orange juice in Florida?
Anita Bryant.
Anita Bryant, who's sort of a precursor to these guys.
That's right.
She's like the Tea Party before there was one. And she was one of the first people to jump in on the gay issue, and she did it by trying to introduce legislation in Florida, correct me if I'm wrong, that would have precluded gay teachers from teaching. She tried to legislate that a gay man, I don't think she thought gay woman, she was like Queen Victoria at that point, but a gay man wouldn't be allowed to teach. She came to see Dad in his home in Rochester, Minnesota, where my parents had rented a place to stay because he was doing so much chemo protocol. And said, well, because I know that you've been, so good on these other issues, she meant the abortion issue, I'm looking for you to support me on this. And Dad told her point blank, and my wife Jeannie, who's over here taking a nap, who could come here and tell you this is the truth, said, do you remember that Dad threw her out of his house? Because she stood up and said, you're not with me on this. Do you mean to say you won't take a stand against homosexuality? And Dad said, absolutely not. Plus, I think what you're doing is horrible. Do you understand that some of the best teachers in the world are homosexuals? Gay wasn't in usage then. How dare you do this to someone? Are you telling, and he said to me, I'll support you on one condition. He says, if the legislation also includes lust, hate, adultery, theft, gluttony, and anything else someone will preclude them from being a teacher. Why stop there? Why have all offices, including ministers? And Dad gave her a speech and said, why would you pick on these people? And this is before the gay issue was a gay issue as such. She was the first one out of the post. So what do you think he'd be telling Mike Huckabee, who's quoting Martin Luther King Jr. Against gay marriage? How do you think that would sit with my dad? Really, the picture you're painting is that if Mike Huckabee, Michelle Bachmann showed up at his office or his house, he would show them the door. He would show them the door. Say, get out of here. He would say, get out of here. If you think I'm signing on to this, you're insane. I don't want to be part of that. Never. It's amazing. And the way Dad would have always put it, I'll put it in Francis Schaefferian terms. He would have literally, with tears in his eyes, leant forward, taken Mike Huckabee's hand and said, but Mike, we're talking about human beings created in the image of God. Why are you doing this to them? How do you think they would feel? Literally, that's where it would be. Dad was all minister when it came to that stuff. So, and that was who my father was. And it had nothing to do with the issue. It was just, what are you talking about? What issue would preclude treating someone the way you want to be treated? What do you mean you'd have legislation that they're not allowed to teach?
I want to tell you something.
And that isn't revisionist because I've gone there. I promise you this is the truth. And no one who knew him well in those years would say anything different.
Well, I got to tell you, that has an effect on me because in some ways, like I said, I was fundamentalist. We weren't allowed to look at art, you know. It was considered, the the devil if a breast
Right.
was exposed. You
Yeah.
know? And so your father opened things up for me, and then suddenly I'm on this path. In some ways, I graduate from being a junior high fundamentalist
Right.
to high school evangelical.
Right.
And then suddenly the whole thing takes this terrible turn.
Yeah.
And in some ways, my life, I was a pastor, a church planter pastor, my life got, even if I didn't want to be part of that, to have the name evangelical,
Yeah.
I became part of that craziness. And that created a huge struggle for me in the 90s.
Yeah.
How do I redefine myself? I don't like the turn this thing is taking,
Right.
you know?
But I
So-
have a question for you, and I
Yeah.
want to jump in on that because, you know, I've known you a little bit, and we've corresponded and so forth. And so, in terms of your own journey out, I want to start at an end point and work
Yeah.
back from there. And that is, and I don't want to embarrass you, but you strike me as one of the gentlest people I know, in the best sense of the word. Actually, somewhat like my father when it comes to that aspect of your personality and how you treat people. And I've watched you around places where, you know, I have a little group of people following you around, but you talk to folks, and, you know, you're a long way from the sort of Christian celebrity ethos, which we all know about.
Yeah.
But from someone who came out of that background, you know, that you and I share, to this point, you know, how did, working back, what are the steps that got you there? Caring about people more than the movement, caring about the movement less than, you know, who you are,
Yeah.
and so on. And I'm just interested in that path.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you something that I normally wouldn't tell this, but it comes to my mind because you mentioned seeing fear in your daughter's
Yeah.
eyes. I was in high school. I was part of the Jesus movement. I actually helped start a church a year out of high school. I was part of this very exciting time. And one of my best friends who was with me through all of that, senior year of high school, we'd been, you know, helping people pray the sinner's prayer and
Yeah.
all that stuff for some years. He came out to me senior year, and I'm remembering the fear in his eyes, and I didn't respond badly. I didn't
Yeah.
respond great. I think I did the best I could, you know. But just remembering that fear sort of comes to my mind because of your story. And I think there were enough of those moments that when I became a pastor, you realize a few times I really made the wrong decision because I was worried about my reputation. Like, if I only cared about the people, I would have done the right thing. But
Yeah.
I cared about my reputation. And there came a point where I just got so tired of that. And so many people, and I hurt some people really badly that I still like cringe when I think about things I said or did. I was just trying to be faithful to what I was told.
Yeah.
It's like you're torn between your mentors looking over your shoulder and the person sitting across from you.
Yeah.
And I had the added sort of complexity that in graduate school I'd studied literature, and in the 1970s, what we now call postmodern philosophy was first coming into the American Academy through literary criticism, through English departments.
Yeah.
And so I remember, in fact, it's funny, I very seldom tell this story, but I was in a graduate school class. We were reading a work by Stanley Fish called Self-Consuming Artifacts, and we were talking about this turn, and which now people call the postmodern turn. And I remember for the first day I got it.
Yeah.
It was like shiver went up my spine. Here's my first thought. Francis Schaeffer and C.S. Lewis don't know how to deal with this.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, I hope this goes away because the people I'm listening to don't know what to do about it.
Yeah.
And of course it didn't go away.
Yeah.
So that really was and I thought I'm going to leave the ministry, and I thought I'm going to leave the Christian faith.
Yeah. And just interject there. So then, when you in a way you left the ministry, in a way you didn't, and you're wrestling with the Christian faith. So at what point do you come to a place where you're saying, okay, I'm going to leave, and then you don't, but you're wrestling with faith still?
Yeah.
Why, and why didn't you just get out?
Well, I'll tell you, when I started going through a really deep period of questioning, I was already a pastor, and it's hard to go through questioning about your faith anytime, but when you make a living doing it, it's a little dicey. I remember going to another pastor, dear friend, and I remember saying, and we had a very honest relationship, so I said, look, I'm asking some big questions, and I just opened my heart, told him I was going through. And he didn't get mad at me, but I
Yeah.
could tell I upset him.
Yeah.
And I thought, if I do this too many times, he won't want to have lunch with me anymore.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I'll lose a friend.
Yeah.
And I just remember thinking, I can't talk to him.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like I was afraid. It was just like,
Yeah.
he's not ready for it. This isn't helping either of us.
Yeah.
But thank God I had a few friends that I could be totally honest with about the questions I was asking.
Yeah.
And Frank, if I didn't have them,
You wouldn't have been able to.
I don't know what would happen to me.
Yeah.
And I should also say, like you, I
Yeah.
married well.
Yeah.
And my wife, she was asking the same questions too.
Yeah.
So we were in it together. You know, but having a few friends made all the difference. There was some dear friends, the folks who we started this church together that I pastored, and they made it clear to me. They said, this is not just your journey, this is our
Yeah.
journey. That made all the difference.
And how do you deal with the pressure that comes just from the point of view of emotionally, from the fact that what you think of yourself as a Christian, there are so many people who you knew before who now say, no, Brian's not a Christian anymore because he doesn't tick these 5 boxes. And that kind of pressure where you're identifying with a club that doesn't want to have you for a member, ultimately.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think about that idea, and how do you deal with it?
I jokingly say, I live in a little tiny town in Florida.
Yeah.
I jokingly say, I'm really glad for this one church that I go to because nobody else has low enough standards that I would be accepted.
Yeah.
No, it is a problem. You know, and sometimes it goes two ways. Sometimes, if I'm really honest, I just say, I get so disgusted. I just think, I just don't like to be around these people. You know, if somebody could put me in a different boat, I'll be happy over there, just because you get tired. But on the other hand, these are people you love too, you know, and their children might be helped by your books and stuff like that. Other times I just feel rude, like, you know, they really want the term Christian, or they really want the term evangelical.
Yeah.
And my being around really ruins their day. So I'm happy to say, look, if you want to say I'm not a Christian, by your definition, I'll be glad to renounce that definition. You know?
Right.
But the irony is, I think actually there's a Jars of Clay song that says something like this, you know, who are we? You know, we don't know who to say we are, where do we belong? And here's the irony that I felt in your book too. There's the sense like, yeah, they might not like me, but Jesus would like me.
Yeah, right, exactly.
You know?
Or at least the people you know best like me better than they used to.
That's right.
But I have a question too, and this implies left, right, middle, Christian, non-Christian. But you know, you've had exposure to leaders like I have. We've known people in leadership positions, and both of us have a certain track record as writers. You know, you have people who follow you around. I have people who follow my work. Thank God, or I couldn't earn a living. By the way, buy my books, everybody, please, because that's all I do have is income.
That's right. People don't understand
No,
that.
they don't understand that. So yeah. That said, and I know this is an odd question. There's no way to put this other. But how have you avoided what befalls so many people who are leaders in any area, but especially somehow in religious areas, whether they're of the right or the left? They just become these sort of grandstanding, you know, really untrustworthy people.
Yeah.
You know, they don't answer emails from people that aren't important. I
Yeah.
put it that way.
Yeah.
Quote
That's a good
unquote
way to say it.
unimportant.
Yeah.
That's the way I would put it. They're just assholes, basically, except they're progressive assholes.
Yeah.
But they're still just grandstanding pontificators who have a following, and then you see it switch off like a light. They leave the platform, and people follow them up a question, they look, and it's just like Washington, D.C. Is the senator behind you more important than you are? Or Hollywood, which I used to be in, as you know, where you go to a party, it's like, I'll talk to this guy for a minute. Oh, wait a minute, there's an agent who can really do something for me. And it's like, I'll see you later. And how have you, because I know you and I've seen you in action, and you are totally not that. You're accessible to people. What's the path that has led to you being that kind of a person rather than one of these guys? Because you've been quite successful. You have people follow you. Why haven't you been corrupted by that?
Well,
because I don't think you have been.
I hope I haven't. Partly it's because who I married. If my head got that big, it would be dealt with real quick. You know.
Right.
But I'll tell you two things. I mean, honestly, one is I really am an introvert, so I'm happiest when I'm being left alone.
Right.
You know? So to me, the attention is more of a sacrifice than it is, a high.
Right.
But the other thing is maybe like what you said about your dad being a minister, you know.
Yeah.
Like, I the people who mentored me into being a follower of Jesus,
Yeah.
it was about loving your neighbor.
Yeah.
Like, that's really what it was about.
Yeah.
And, so that really, a lot of things didn't stick, but
Yeah.
that has stuck. And that's
Yeah.
at least what I aspire to.
Yeah, because you've observed this too, but a lot of times in Christian work, again, evangelicals through to the most progressive, hotshot,
Yeah.
progressive people, you really get a sneaking suspicion all of these guys would have rather been rock gods.
Yeah.
And they couldn't make it in the rock and roll business, and so they do the next best thing, and that is they write Christian bestsellers and have people follow you around. And the mentality's the same.
Well, that
And
might,
it's like a disease, and since it affects left and right, progressive and fundamentalists, obviously this goes deeper
That's right.
than labels.
Yeah. And that might take us
Conversely, I know some fundamentalists who are fantastically compassionate, open people
That's
who are
right.
not jerks.
Exactly
And
right.
I may disagree with them, but wow, would I rather be stuck on a desert island with some people who I would disagree all the way down the line. I'd say they're narrow. Officially, they come off as unloving, blah, 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 blah. Half the world's going to hell. And yet, man, you want this guy for your neighbor.
They would treat you like a human being,
Yeah,
made in
with
the image
great
of God.
dignity.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Well, that's
what's-
probably a good place to come around full circle, because at that point you realize, Christians are having this problem
Right.
of a resurgence of fundamentalism.
Yeah,
Muslims are having this problem.
Right.
This is a reality in the Jewish community, Hindu community.
Yeah.
And so you realize, these are human problems.
yeah,
And it so much comes back to, as you said, looking in your granddaughter's eyes. And
right.
these very, very human things.
And the people who know you best where you can't duck it.
Exactly.
Because, they actually know.
Well, that's something I appreciate about our friendship, and I
Yeah.
love about your writing. It's just a celebration of good things in humanity,
Well, it's sweet that you say that.
and a fury about the bad things.
Yeah, yeah.
And we're all in that struggle. Thanks, man.
Thanks. Nice talking with you.